Well, we've talked a little bit about Ulster-Scots today, but what about the future? You are both writers, you're both researchers. What would you like to see the future roll out for Ulster-Scots?
I think a big problem at the minute is the absence of publishing opportunities. So there needs to be some attention given to that. I think it's maybe easier to get published if you're writing in Irish. It's just hard, full stop. If you're writing in Ulster-Scots, or if you bring attention to the fact that you're writing in Ulster-Scots, maybe that's what it is.
Absolutely, because the novel that I have sort of ready to go forward for publication. I mean, I've had a couple of readers, people in the industry talking about how it's quiet and the language is a bit hokey, So we've had a couple of comments about the language that have been kind of on the negative side, and I think that isn't recognised. The value, the merit of that colloquial kind of discourse isn't maybe fully recognised as the value that it has. So that's a very good point. People that are going to take on board what you're trying to do and recognise the richness, that cultural aspect,
And we've mainly been talking about the language, which is my real interest with regard to Ulster-Scots, but there are a lot of people who are interested in Ulster-Scots culturally as well. And if you don't fund writers, and if you don't have a publishing outlet for writers, you won't have that voice. That won't be disseminated throughout society. And I remember when I published Snugville Street at first, I published it myself, and it was in standard English. And the biggest observation I got was, we've never seen ourselves on paper like that before. So I had been depicting a community in the Shankill area, and that voice is missing. I don't know if that would necessarily be considered Ulster-Scots culturally. I think it definitely crosses over. There are things like van parades, all that kind of stuff that are incidental, not the major part of the story, but if you don't give those opportunities to writers, and if you don't provide a way for them to be published, then their voice won't be heard.
And I suppose that follows into broadcasting as well, given so much of, so many of the stories that we actually come into contact with, we see them on screen. So what do you think needs to be happening, in that respect?
Yeah, we should be seeing ourselves on screen, shouldn't we? If you should see your own cultural background on screen at some point, I think.
Yeah, it's the same with the literary tradition, because that's what I've written about too, in terms of the literary aspect, that if you don't see yourself represented, then you feel that that's not for you. Culture isn't your thing. So you do need to see some version of what represents your familiar lifestyle before you kind of fully embrace, that then maybe writing or broadcasting or whatever might be something I could do as well. So absolutely, I think that's a strong aspect that maybe needs attention. But something you said there made me think, the word hybridity is coming into my mind, that we're kind of, Ulster-Scots is a strong factor along with the variations of English, and I think we need to also include it in the bigger picture that we're all in a hybrid kind of culture here, and we kind of borrow from the Gaelic language and the English language as well as the Scots, and it's a big melting pot. It's kind of something that it's not just there's this and then there's this. It's not a binary thing. It's a big mix. So I think we need to also take that into account going forward, and kind of open things up maybe to sort of a shared way of representing culture and broadcast, literary, whatever it is, music and so on as well.
Because it's one of those ironies in a way that Americans talk about having a hyphenated culture. You're an Irish American, a Polish American. That this idea of Ulster Scottishness fits into so many others, similar hyphenated hybrid identities around the world, that it's not the exception. I think sometimes the danger is seeing that uniqueness as being completely singular, whereas it's the same type of experience that people have across Europe, across Asia, and the Americas as well, that actually we are part of a global story, whether we
Absolutely.
want to admit to it or not.
Yeah, yeah. And I think maybe then, so there is probably promotion in terms of the Ulster-Scots culture because it has kind of been neglected or not recognised or not seen maybe fully. But to remember that in promoting that, that it's still part of that bigger picture as well. It's not just this one little thing we're going to kind of steamroller through, you know, it's part of a much bigger picture. You know?
What advice would you give to somebody who was just starting out to write and had an inkling to maybe use Ulster-Scots in their work? What advice as a writer would you give them? Not to crowd out, the Ulster-Scots writing sphere, but what would you say to them?
I would love to see more people, because I hear the voices on the street. So more people need to be writing the way that they speak. And we talked about Michelle Gallen earlier. Big Girl, Small Town is just a great example of bringing that voice to the page. It's what I would call Ulster English, really, but it's got lots and lots of Scots in it. And that was, done without bringing attention to the whole thing. And I just think that so many people could be doing that, and we'd be much richer for it. You know, it would make us, our voices very unique. I know that people down south are very receptive to Ulster-Scots. When they read it, they enjoy it because it's something different. It's something they maybe, particularly in Dublin, they maybe weren't brought up with. I said earlier about the people who are in other places who were brought up with it, and so it brings them joy in that in a different way. Donegal at the minute, there's a massive Ulster-Scots revival there. There's the Francis Brown Festival, which is a multilingual festival, brings a lot of attention to Ulster-Scots and encourages and nurtures Ulster-Scots writing. And the more competitions you have and the more events you have to encourage people, you know, sometimes I actually sit down and think, oh, there's a competition, the Linden Hall Library competition, for example, and I'll go and write a piece of that I wouldn't have done otherwise, you know. So these kind of things encourage people, and that I think that's why we've had this big, massive, revival in the last few years.
I wonder if there's a question too of formality, because I'm not familiar with formal modes of Ulster-Scots in writing, and that would kind of nearly put me off going more fully into it. So I think you would want it to be open to all variations too,
Yes.
so that somebody coming into my writing class who feels like writing in dialect in a style or phonetically, whatever way, that's all okay, that you kind of keep it open and let everybody kind of have their own approach, and you're not too rigid in making rules around it, I think, because that can be a bit off. But I'm not saying don't have rules or don't have formal structures that you can then maybe check out, but don't have that as an obstacle maybe to people coming through in terms of literary work.
One of the things I've always thought is that this should be something to allow us to play with, that it's something that is there for experimentation, and that we should allow ourselves those times when we experiment and it doesn't necessarily go right, that we don't throw everything out because of that. Yeah. So the one thing I would say is that we hold on to the idea of permission and a curiosity to play with the possibilities of where we could make connections.
Well, what I would say, it sounds very much like when you begin to write a piece, you don't expect to write a good piece straight away, so you let yourself write any old rubbish, and you have to let the rubbish come out first. So maybe it's something about now, but this isn't maybe answering your question, but you kind of need to allow everything. So maybe what I was saying earlier, so for example, I'm thinking in writing groups that I'm running, you let everybody just write, and it's quite difficult because they want to be all correct and proper straight away. But I think it's really good to learn to just write complete rubbish, but to let it flow, to let yourself go with it, whatever language or whatever story or whatever it is, and just really run with that. And it's only then later you maybe bring in the checks and the formal, maybe check the dictionary, or if you're going for formal Ulster-Scots, then turn to the dictionary at that point. But I think open it up in that same way as the creative process for me anyway. You kind of write an awful lot of rubbish before you get to something that's kind of, fine-tuned and a wee bit honed down. So that's not quite answering your question, but
I think that what would be useful is to prioritise for the writing world the literary technique over the language, so that we start to see people, we start to see writers experiment with Ulster-Scots rather than necessarily Ulster-Scots speakers experiment with writing.
Yes.
okay.
Because we need to bring those skills in, and some of the writing that you see is, brilliant Ulster-Scots writing, but maybe the person isn't a writer, and I think that each party can teach each other a lot of stuff. So I would like to see that more, through competitions and so on, that we see what we expect from good writing to appear in Ulster-Scots writing. So
that's like
am I taking away anything there, or bringing something?
No.
But it's a wee bit of a flip to what I'm saying. So the people that I'm encouraging to write anything at all could meet the people that you're the writing experts, as it were, and have a sort of a cross pollination of those groups.
Those people that you're talking about, I think we're both saying the same thing in a sense, because if you're in school nowadays, the teacher will allow the students to do some free writing where they'll have the chance to get their thoughts down on paper first.
Yeah.
And then they prioritise spelling and so on afterwards. So that's the same thing.
Yes,
so we're prioritising the writing first. We're prioritising. So say you have a writing group and you have someone doing a little bit of memoir, and you just want them to write in the voice of their childhood and get on with it, and you don't want them to stop and worry about spelling and all that stuff.
Yeah,
To
totally.
me, that's good writing, because you're just letting it flow. Whereas if you're stopping and stuttering about, do you spell to
Exactly.
T-O, or do you
stops
say
your-
T-A-E, or and some people use A for I, or some people use A-H, and that can affect the flow, and even when you're reading your work back, it can start to get confusing. So just try and forget all that for a minute and get the voice.
But then, like you're saying too, to bring in writers to focus on Ulster-Scots and sort of develop it as well.
Yeah.
Sort of that's like a further down the line.
Because in a way, there are two very different end processes. One is language development.
Yep.
One is writing development.
Yeah.
And there's no reason why those processes both can't work together. But you need to know when you compartmentalize one activity over another, and what the end product is going to be.
It's a bit like when I was saying earlier, the first novels that I wrote in standard English, reading back that work now, it's almost a little bit embarrassing for me, because it sounds so condescending, because I had really used very proper English that I was taught at school and hadn't yet found a voice. And so, it's a bit like that with Ulster-Scots. If you're just going to write in really proper Ulster-Scots, abiding by all the rules and guidebooks, you're not going to find your own voice.
Yeah, because again, it's that paradox of writing. The best writing breaks the rules. The best writing is the one that, yes, it fits within the parameters of the genre, but it breaks out of the genre at any number of times, either formally or in terms of content. And that's what's most pleasing. And sometimes that's one of the hardest things to teach, because good writers intrinsically just know when they're going to go away from what they should be doing.
There is a wee bit of maybe a problem sometimes if someone has maybe just looked something up in a dictionary, or maybe they have conjugated the verb incorrectly or something like that. I think that it's good to go along and say, look, you wouldn't really say that in Ulster-Scots because it maybe isn't sounding natural.
Right.
So freedom, yes, in terms of the style and all the rest of it, but maybe just an editorial process as well, a little bit.
Yeah, because other times you have linguistic anarchy, then, and you lose, if you're particularly trying to glimpse of something which was an authentic time and place and person, if they've done, if they have gone awry, then it's to the person who knows, they know it's very off key, and so I think that's when you have the ability to say, and that then the writing gets better.
and just doing lots of writing, so more of everything. I think writing improves by doing more of it and doing more reading. So providing opportunities for, as you say, the competitions and the programmes in Ulster-Scots and in general, to open it up and create more opportunities for people to write. There's Fighting Words. I've done a little bit of work with them in the past, opening up the possibility of writing for youngsters. And I mean, to my mind, it was always really lovely the way they did that, very open and kind of all kind of offerings were taken in a really encouraging way. And so that would be the process that then if you wanted to continue, then you'd probably look at the editing later, but those workshops are really encouraging. So just more writing and more encouragement of reading as well. And reading of Ulster-Scots then too, because then that's going to sort of cross-fertilise as well.
And it all comes back to building an audience and supporting the writers and the people who are telling the story, because without that creative spark, there's no point in having an audience or doing things, because you're only doing things because it's either seen as worthy or you're ticking a box for for some sort of social experiment.
Yeah, and I think as well, going back to the editorial side of things, if you're writing in English, you go through a process naturally in the writing world. So when I did my first novel, the first thing I did was hire someone to help edit the piece. So there's a company in Dublin, and a writer looked at my work and assessed it, and almost like not quite a mentoring service. I know you've had mentors, so all that stuff isn't happening in Ulster-Scots really at the minute at all.
That's very, it's one of those things that as much as you need the writer, you need the person with the editorial skills as well. And I think it's something that we'd
And it doesn't have to be someone who speaks Ulster-Scots. It can be a writer who, most people can figure out Ulster-Scots, unless it's written in a really, really dense way. So to go back to one of the examples we had there, Michelle Gallen's book is easy to read. Buddha Da from Anne Donovan in Scotland, easy to read. It's not written in a formal Scots. She uses her own way of spelling the words and all the rest of it. So it doesn't have to be someone who has the language training, but someone who can assess a manuscript or a poem and give feedback on it would be quite useful. I think that will up the game a little bit, and you'll see more quality writing coming through those competitions.
Yeah, and with the lack, although there are a couple of small presses that are dedicated to producing Ulster-Scots word, with the effective lack of a dedicated press.
A lot of people would like to be published by Tramp Press. If they were to take on something like an Ulster-Scots book, if there was some incentive for them to do that, that would, because they do, I think they do some Irish work. I know they did the lovely story, Ghost in the Throat. And it was all about that Irish poem, so there was a lot of Irish in it, even if it was written in English. So that's where most writers will want to sit. They'll not necessarily want to be cordoned off into an Ulster-Scots press.
That's right.
Unless you have the sort of like a Faber and Faber, level of this is the press to get published with. But I think, if you had 15 Irish presses and they produced an Ulster-Scots poetry collection or novel each year, imagine what that would do for the reading and interpretation and acceptance levels that Ulster-Scots would be getting.
I'm pretty sure Irish has gone through this, in the past themselves, trying to get more funding and recognition, and they probably still have that battle today of trying to get more Irish publications. So I think this is like quite typical of
I think it's very much the story of a minority culture that other minority cultures suffer from this too, and it's often one of our difficulties is that one group does not speak to another, because there's it's quite obvious that there could be a lot of help and support provided from one house for the other.
I'm just thinking how that could work sort of across the islands that we live on. You know, like for me, I'm coming from a rural writing background, so there are little pockets of rural writers. So it's a bit like that. You're kind of taking one strand, but kind of uniting it with its friends in other parts of the country or the archipelago, whatever. And you could do that across a wider geography as well.
Yeah.
You know, so you could look at the minority dialects and so on, maybe in a broader way, and then unite them.
Well, it's one of those funny things that we often go in cycles. In this way, I even thinking to people like John Hewitt, who were very aware of the local, but were aware of the local within Ulster, you know, within Belfast, within his county, within Northern Ireland, within GB, and within Europe. So those connections are as local as you want to play them.
I also think there needs to be more happening between Scotland and Ireland.
I was just going to say, isn't the Scots Macar currently a Gaelic speaker? The recently, I can't remember his name now, but yeah, the recently appointed one is from like the Outer Hebrides or somewhere. So I think that's bringing a whole new kind of emphasis on the variety of language. If I knew its name, that would help, but I don't know. Yeah, so that might kind of help to broaden things out in Scotland. So, you know, feeding into what you were about to say.
And in a sense, you have language acts in Scotland, language acts here, and there's, you know, supposedly a whole new way of dealing with language, although the Ulster-Scots and British Commissioner may be different to the Irish Language Commissioner, but it sets up possibilities of more ways, I think, to create opportunities and better ways of working if you can get the commissioners to work as a team rather than to work either, you know, in their silos or against each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
So some kind of like publishing effort across the water would be useful as well. And I don't mean like a small publishing house, you know, well, I do mean a small publishing house probably. I don't mean just like a niche, you know, Scots writing, something a bit more broad than that, that brings what you might call in academic terms Scottish and Irish studies together.
Yeah, and there has been in the past attempts at doing that and projects that looked at that. So in a sense, there's nothing wrong with being greedy, because you can have a wider Irish and Scottish connection in the same way that you can have something like the Yarns anthology that publishes work from Scotland and Ireland as well. So there's no harm in having projects that set up at different times doing different things, but it's I think it's looking into the possibilities of how you could develop, and for all writers and for readers as well, that there are stories that are to be told and haven't necessarily been articulated yet.
Yeah. So we want the Faber and Faber of Ireland and Scotland.
Yeah.
Is that what we're thinking?
Yeah, sort of making those wee links around the edges, you know, all those little minority groupings sort of coming together under an umbrella, kind of.
Yeah, because perhaps, in a way they speak to. It's that difference that flips between what's a minority and what's a majority. You know, if you've Scottish literature, you've Irish literature, you've Northern Irish literature, you've Ulster-Scots literature, and in many ways Ulster-Scots literature touches upon all of those bases and can be extremely broad in what it does and says, so that you're not necessarily held back by this has to necessarily be a small thing. It's dependent upon the ambition of the writer in what people might write here or what might be adopted from Northern Irish literature for European and other audiences.
Yeah. It's already happening with like the likes of Shuggy Bain's Booker prize-winning novel. Well, that was the name of the novel, not the writer. Yeah, the likes of Shuggie Bain's already out there in lots of different languages. There's loads of Scots in it. So, you know, these don't have to be small, limited things. You can reach a really wide audience and having some way of promoting those minority tongues. I'm saying the word tongue because it's safe. If you call it a language, you get in trouble.
Yeah. Tongue's almost is your go-to word.
And then you slip into people that, you know, the translation for tongue in French is la langue, and you just let that linger with them and walk away, and they figure it out maybe eventually.
The penny drops.
Well, I think since we're now veering into French rather than Ulster-Scots, it's a good moment.
I recently wrote something in French and Ulster-Scots.
Wow.
Well,
You're setting the headline, Angeline.
Well, that almost lets me ask my first or my last question then. What do you see maybe as your next writing project without giving too much away to anyone else? So you're already veering towards a French and Ulster-Scots story.
No, I'm
But
not.
you and I have a joint project, don't we? Because our two protagonists are going to meet.
They have to. We've got these two like stories that are like the protagonists are like cousins or
they had
like
a very
cousins, like
very similar
cousins.
trajectory, and both ended up studying in Scotland. So they might meet in Glasgow and go
maybe.
further afield, or
I'm actually going to the Netherlands for the next
Okay.
thing, so I just got an Arts Council grant to write the follow-up to my PhD novel,
brilliant.
which is called The Secret Diary of Stephanie Agnew. So I'm going to take her to the Netherlands
Oh.
because I lived there and I'm lazy and I don't have to do too much research about about the streets and everything, because I can just describe what I know. There will be some research in terms of the historical element of it. I always have like a little family history story, but it'll be a very modern novel, very European, very sort of early 2000s, and there will be part of the language story will continue.
Okay.
So in The Secret Diary of Stephanie Agnew, she doesn't acknowledge Ulster-Scots because it's not talked about in 1995. Well, it probably was with the likes of Philip Robinson and all the people who are involved in the Ulster-Scots revival, but it wasn't something that I would have heard of at that time. So a penny's going to drop about language when she's surrounded by those sounds. I mean, that's going to be a small part of the story, but it's just to continue the language story.
That's and no spoilers, of course.
No, that didn't give away anything about the plot. She's going to be mad. It's going to be totally mad.
Excellent. Good. Well, I think it's time to revisit. I've kind of just put the finishing touches on edits for A Quiet Hill, which is my PhD novel. So I'm looking to query that and get it out into the world. But again, the publishing questions there. But yeah, so I think I'll pick up with Margaret and see where her journey takes her next. She's in Scotland, so, you know, they may cross paths.
You should take her to Germany.
Yeah, I may take her to Germany or to France, and we'll have
She
to
lives
see.
in Germany, that's why I say that.
Yeah. So again, the familiarity would
I can
help,
envisage a European
there's going to be a tour.
Hogmanay special when these two characters meet up. So
they'll go interrail, and then that'll be it.
Yeah, that's the third novel sorted out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So
I'd love to do a French one too, by the way, but I just couldn't think of a reason to do it at that particular moment.
yeah, well, maybe we could put our heads together and think of something there.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that sets us up for lots of activity in the coming years. Ulster-Scots is alive and healthy in your hands, and we look forward to many more books to come. So
And we haven't
thank
spoken
you.
a word all day.
But that's given the job for an Ulster-Scots translator down the line.
That's right.